Hi everyone, and welcome to our Market Research Report screencast. Today, we will be reviewing our analysis on fake news. We are Team Q, and I am Shelby Cannon.
I'm Wes Lowe.
I'm Carly Yerbaran.
And I'm Maddie Desjardins.
Fake news is defined as news articles or any other form of news that is designed to intentionally misinform those who are absorbing the information. Any journalistic institution that considers themselves a news source can essentially say anything online and not face extreme consequences if their information is misleading or not legitimate. This, in turn, leads to a public that is misinformed and not receiving accurate information. Understanding the scope of how deeply fake news affects our society will help us determine solutions that can rectify this issue. This project is aimed to measure college students' ability to identify the fake news that they see on social media, along with what their perception of their ability is. We selected college students for the sample of our study because we believe that within a matter of years, many will be the leading decision makers for our society. Fake news is a problem within our society that could have potentially dramatic effects if left unchecked. According to a study at Stanford, when evaluating middle school, high school, and college students on their ability to evaluate sources, the results were shockingly subpar. The use of fake news and propaganda was greatly illustrated in the 2016 presidential campaign. This election proved to spur a variety of fake news, with many election reports coming from fake sites and producing fraudulent claims. These sites can go largely unchecked by the large social media platforms where they prosper. According to an article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, a number of commentators have suggested that Donald Trump would not have been elected president were it not for the influence of fake news, illustrating the reach and impact that fake news has. In 2016, Pew Research suggested that 62% of Americans use social media to access some form of news. This demonstrates how reliant individuals who live in the US are on this type of medium to receive information. This led us to our research question. Are college students' perceived abilities correlated with their actual abilities to identify a legitimate versus illegitimate news source online? Does their actual ability to discern between real and fake news depend on the participants' use of social media?
We came up with 3 specific research objectives for our project. The first being to assess respondents' knowledge of what they believe is a credible and fake news source on online platforms with a questionnaire quiz, to evaluate the correlation between respondents' self-perceptions and actual ability to distinguish between real and fake news, and lastly, to determine what real and fake news sources are deemed credible or not credible amongst college students.
To dive into our research design, we administered a 21-question qualitative survey amongst fellow college students. Images were shown to gauge their views on certain media examples. The images were chosen on the basis of a previous Stanford study.
Now let's take a look at our sampling technique. For our sample frames, in order to reach our target population of college students, we used a combination of class email lists provided through Blackboard to gather a diverse list of both male and female students from a variety of majors. We also utilized SDSU class Facebook group pages to reach a variety of different class levels. We had low errors of inclusion and omission when we utilized these sampling frames due to the fact that college students are the primary subjects of these sampling frames, and the majority of these college students have access to email and Facebook as social media channels. The sample we collected was a subset of non-probability sampling, a convenient sample. Although we had a final sample size of 91, in order to accurately interpret both variable measures and come to conclusions, our optimal sample size combined should have been 1,906. In order to get a final sample of 91, let's look at our sample validation summary, where we had to omit many responses. We had 2 test responses, 8 responses who failed to make it through the screening questions, 1 response who didn't complete the key questions, and 35 who failed to meet our 2-minute minimum time requirement. Looking at our demographics, most of our respondents were female, Democratic, within the age range of 20 to 22, and identified as white or European. Let's now take a look at some key variables that we measured. First, with the image questionnaire quiz, we found that when respondents were presented with 4 images of real and fake news clips and were asked to identify the news clip as credible or not credible on a 5-point Likert scale, we had an average of only 2.08 out of 4. However, when respondents were asked to rate their ability to distinguish between real and fake news on a 5-point Likert scale, which was then recoded to good or bad with dummy coding, we found that a large majority of respondents identified as having a good ability. Social media usage was also an important variable to measure in our survey. We asked respondents to enter a numerical value of the average hours they spent a day on social media platforms. We found on average that our respondents engaged with social media platforms for about 3.28 hours on a typical day. We also used this average as a baseline in further analysis. In order to analyze our data, we broke down our 3 objectives that we ultimately wanted to focus on in order to answer our research question. For the first objective, we used the sum function to aggregate the total image quiz scores for each respondent. As mentioned previously, respondents were presented with 4 images of online news articles. Judgment of correctness was based on rating the credibility of the online news article, which ultimately gave us a total score for each individual respondent. We then compared these results to frequent versus non-frequent social media users with an extra question we included in our survey, and we will go into more depth about this in our key results. For the second objective, we first had to recode respondents' self-perceptions of their ability to distinguish between real and fake news, which was measured on a 5-point Likert scale. We segmented respondents into 2 groups, high self-perception versus low self-perception with dummy coding. We then conducted a chi-square test with our 2 categorical variables, image scores 0 to 4 and high versus low self-perception to measure the correlation. For the third objective, we created a correlation matrix to explore the linear association between 6 interval variables. We had 10 interval questions that allowed respondents to rank the credibility of 10 real and fake news sources on a 5-point scale. For our research purposes, we decided to measure the associations between 6 key variables. These key variables were 6 news sources: foxnews.com, cnn.com, cbs.com, abcnews.com.co, worldnewsdailyreport.com, and the bostontribune.com. For this correlation matrix, we also were able to look at the descriptive statistics output, giving us the mean credibility scores for each real and fake news source.
Our first objective of the report was to assess the participants' knowledge of what they believe is a credible news source on online platforms with a questionnaire quiz. In the survey, respondents were presented with 4 images of online news articles from 2 sources that were fake and 2 sources that were real. Judgment of correctness was based on rating the credibility of the online news articles that respondent was presented with. This ultimately gave us a total score for each individual respondent, ranging from 0 to 4 points. Of our 91 people we sampled, 88 fully completed the fake news identification quiz score. 42% got 2 out of 4 questions correct, and the mean score was 2.08. We hypothesized that the social media usage would negatively impact people's ability to determine fake news. We then chose to compare that with their social media usage frequency. We divided the respondents into groups of frequent and non-frequent social media usage. Through analyzing the number of hours per day spent on social media platforms that students entered. We then compared the mean score of both groups to identify if there was a statistically significant difference in the 2 group scores. Here we can see how we divided the non-frequent and frequent social media users and then compared their fake news identification quiz scores. The mean for frequent social media users was slightly higher, but there was not a significant difference in the scores, and therefore we cannot conclude social media affects ability to distinguish between real and fake news.
Looking at our findings for the second objective, which entailed evaluating the correlation between respondents' perceptions versus actual ability to distinguish between real and fake news sources, our team concluded that there is very little correlation in the data. We also found that very little respondents identified as having a poor ability to distinguish between real and fake news. Looking at the stacked bar charts we have here, we found there is very little differentiation between the average image scores and the self-perception scores, considering the significantly larger amount of respondents that identified as having a good self-perception. Here is our chi-square correlation crosstab. Overall, if a respondent identified as having a good self-perception, Did that affect the image quiz score? Referring to the crosstab below, if someone scored a 0, 1, or 2 on the image quiz, there seems to be a very little correlation between their subjective self-perception score due to the small difference in the count versus expected count. But if someone scored a 3 or 4 on the image quiz, the difference between the count and expected count differed ever so more slightly with a 1.7 difference. We can conclude that there may be a small correlation between the higher image score, 3 and 4, and self-perception. For Objective 3, we created a correlation matrix to explore the relationships between the credibility of 6 news sources. The credibility was measured using a 5-point Likert scale, with 1 being not at all credible and 5 being very credible. The mean credibility score for all of these sources was a little over 3, which can be reflected as neither credible or not credible. This is interesting, seeing as three of these sources are indeed not credible news sources. In the next slide, I will further analyze the relationships of these news sources. The source with the highest average credibility was CNN.com at 4.16, and the source with the lowest average credibility was WorldNewsDailyReport.com at 3.27. The two news sources with the highest correlation were the BostonTribune.com and ABCNews.com.co, with a correlation coefficient of 0.495. This means that people were very likely to give these two sources the same credibility score. This number makes some sort of sense given that both of these sources are not credible, but does not really describe why, on average, people still gave them such a high credibility score. The two sources with the lowest correlation coefficient were WorldNewsDailyReport.com and CBS.com, with a correlation coefficient of negative 0.231, meaning that people were unlikely to give these two sources the same credibility score. A negative number makes sense here because CBS.com is considered to be a credible source, while WorldNewsDailyReport.com is considered to be not credible.
When analyzing our data, we found that much of what we hypothesized was not proven, and we were not able to draw as many conclusions as we would have liked. Some of the limitations we faced were due to convenient sampling, which did not provide the most accurate representation of our target population. We feel had we included more dependent variables and questions with different levels of data, we would have been able to run more tests and performed a better analysis. Our hypotheses were not proven, but we can still see that through our research we need better media literacy. This can be illustrated through the mean score of our fake news quiz and what sites respondents viewed as credible. A better understanding of what fake news sites look like and the different types of fake news would be incredibly beneficial to not only college students, but everyone. Here we have provided the operational definitions for which we based our research project on. Thank you for listening.